A 7-year-old girl with nothing, but half a sandwich, made a choice that would break your heart and change everything. She didn't know the dying man in the alley was worth billions, only that if she walked away, he wouldn't survive the night. What she gave up to save him, and what happened when his son discovered the truth, will shake you to your core. Wait, before we continue, I need you to do something right now. If you want to see what happens next, if you want to know whether Vivian ever finds a real home, whether Stephen survives, and what his billionaire son does when he discovers the truth, then you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because I promise you, the next 10 minutes will completely change how you see the world. This isn't just another story. This is about a choice that will wreck you emotionally and restore your faith in humanity at the same time. So subscribe now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And let's continue this journey together. Trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. Now let's get back to Vivian's story. Vivian Stones had mastered the art of being invisible. At 7 years old, she understood that survival on Chicago's South Side meant disappearing into doorways, moving through shadows, and never making eye contact. The oversized Chicago Bulls hoodie that hung past her knees helped. So did the mismatched sneakers, one Velcro, one lace-up, that she'd pulled from different donation bins. The cold bit through her layers as she huddled behind Lambert's 24-hour drugstore, clutching the paper bag that held everything she owned. Inside was half a turkey sandwich she'd saved from the church soup kitchen that morning, wrapped carefully in a napkin. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she'd learned to wait. Eating too early meant waking up starving in the middle of the night with nothing left. Father Paul Thompson had taught her that. Before he died 3 months ago, he'd been the only person who looked at her like she mattered. "You're stronger than you know, little one," he'd say, his weathered hands warm on her shoulders. God sees you, even when the world doesn't. Now Father Paul was gone, and Vivian was alone again. She'd spent the day scavenging, checking payphones for forgotten quarters, searching trash cans outside restaurants for unfinished meals, collecting cans for the recycling center. $5.37. Enough for maybe 2 more days if she was careful. The alley behind the drugstore was her usual spot. Joanna Wilson, who worked the night shift inside, knew she slept there but never called the police. Sometimes she'd leave expired snacks by the back door. Tonight, though, something was different. Vivian heard it before she saw it, a wet, rattling sound like someone drowning on dry land. She pressed herself against the cold brick wall, her small body tensing. Then she saw him. An old man in a torn, expensive suit lay crumpled against the opposite wall, one hand clutching his chest, the other scraping weakly at the pavement. Blood trickled from a cut on his temple. His face was gray, his lips moving soundlessly. Vivian's first instinct was to run. Strange men were dangerous. Everyone knew that. But as she watched, his hand stopped moving. His eyes rolled back, glassy and unfocused. He was dying. She thought about Father Paul, about the last time she'd seen him in the hospital before his heart gave out, about how his hand had felt in hers, cold, fragile, desperate. Vivian crept closer. "Mister." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. The man's eyes found hers, and in them she saw pure terror, the kind of fear that transcended wealth or status or pride. He was just a human being, alone and dying in the dark. She knelt beside him, her knees pressing into a puddle of freezing water. Up close, she could smell cologne mixed with something metallic, blood. His breathing was wrong, too fast and too shallow, each breath a struggle. "Help," he whispered, the word barely audible. Vivian looked around the empty alley. No one was coming. No one ever came here. Her hand moved to her paper bag. Inside was the sandwich, her only food until tomorrow's soup kitchen. She pulled it out with trembling fingers and unwrapped it carefully. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. The man's hand shook as he tried to reach for it, but his fingers wouldn't work. The sandwich slipped from his grasp and fell into the puddle. Vivian stared at the ruined bread, her stomach twisting. Then she looked at the man's face again, at the way his chest barely moved, at how his eyes were starting to glaze over. She knew what she had to do. Vivian's feet pounded against the wet pavement as she ran toward the drugstore's bright windows, her mismatched shoes slapping out an uneven rhythm. The cold air burned her lungs. Behind her, the man's rasping breaths grew fainter. The bell above the door jangled violently as she burst inside. Fluorescent lights blinded her after the darkness of the alley. Joanna Wilson looked up from behind the counter, her face shifting from boredom to annoyance. "Kid, I told you, no begging in here. I'll leave food out back, but you can't." Vivian ran to the counter, her small hands gripping the edge. She opened her mouth, but no words came. They never did when she needed them most. Her throat locked up the way it always had since her mother disappeared, since the world taught her that speaking only brought pain. She pointed frantically toward the back door, toward the alley, her whole arm shaking. "I don't have time for charades," Joanna said, her voice sharp. "Either buy something or get out." Panic flooded through Vivian's chest. He was dying right now, and no one understood. Her hand dove into her hoodie pocket, fingers closing around the precious bills and coins she'd collected all day. $5.37. Everything she had. Everything between her and starvation. She pulled out the crumpled bills and handful of change and slammed them on the counter, pushing them toward Joanna with both hands. Then she pointed again, harder this time, her eyes wide and desperate and shining with tears she refused to let fall. Joanna's expression changed. She looked at the money, then at Vivian's face, then at the back door. "Someone's hurt? Out there." Vivian nodded, so hard her whole body moved. Joanna grabbed the phone. "This is Wilson at Lambert's Drugstore, 47th and King. I need an ambulance behind my store. Someone's collapsed. Yeah, it's serious. Hurry." Vivian didn't wait to hear the rest. She was already running back outside, the bell jangling again as the door swung shut. She had to get back to him. She couldn't let him die alone. When she reached the alley, the man was still there, but he'd slumped further down the wall. His hand had stopped moving entirely. Vivian dropped to her knees beside him, her small fingers finding his hand. It was so cold. "They're coming," she whispered, even though she knew he probably couldn't hear her. "Help is coming. You're not alone." The man's eyes opened slightly, just slits, and moved toward her voice. His lips formed a word, but no sound came out. His fingers, though, squeezed hers with the faintest pressure. A thank you in touch. In the distance, a siren wailed. Red and blue lights began to flicker against the brick walls. The ambulance pulled up to the mouth of the alley, its headlights flooding the space with harsh white light. Two paramedics jumped out, moving fast. They rushed past Vivian as if she didn't exist, their boots splashing through puddles. She let go of the man's hand and scooted backward, pressing herself against the dumpster, making herself small and invisible the way she'd learned to be. "Pulse is weak," one paramedic said. "Possible MI. Let's move." They worked quickly, checking vitals, starting in 4, lifting the man onto a stretcher. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, his head turned slightly, his eyes searching the shadows for her. But Vivian stayed hidden, watching from behind the dumpster as they loaded him inside. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The siren wailed again, piercing and urgent. The vehicle pulled away, its taillights disappearing around the corner. Then the alley was empty again, silent. Vivian stayed crouched behind the dumpster for a long time, hugging herself against the cold. Her sandwich was gone. Her money was gone. Everything she had worked for today was gone. But somewhere out there, a man who had been dying was now alive. She looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings. Stars were starting to appear, pinpricks of light in the darkness. Vivian wondered what Father Paul would say if he could see her now. Maybe, "You were supposed to use that for yourself, child." Or maybe, "You did exactly what you were meant to do." She'd never know for sure. But as she curled up in her corner of the alley, pulling her hoodie tight around her thin body. Something small and warm flickered in her chest beneath all the cold and hunger. The knowledge that somewhere tonight someone was breathing because of her. And maybe, for now, that was enough. Stephen Musk woke to whiteness. White ceiling, white walls, white sheets tucked tight around him. The smell of antiseptic burned his nostrils. His chest ached with a deep, bruised pain that spread from his sternum outward. Mr. Musk. A nurse appeared at his bedside, relief washing over her face. Welcome back. You gave us quite a scare. Where? His throat was sandpaper dry. Chicago General. You had a massive heart attack. You're very lucky to be alive, sir. Lucky. Stephen closed his eyes, trying to piece together fragments of memory. The business meeting that had run late. Walking to his car through the South Side shortcut he'd taken 100 times. The two men who'd come out of nowhere. The blow to his head. His wallet gone. Then the crushing pain in his chest that had dropped him like a stone. He remembered darkness. Cold pavement. The certainty that he was going to die alone in a forgotten alley because his pride had made him refuse a driver, refuse security, refuse to show any sign of weakness. And then something else. A small face. Dark eyes wide with concern. Tiny cold hands holding his. How did I get here? He asked. Ambulance brought you in from behind a drugstore on the south side. The 911 call came from the store clerk. Who found me? The nurse checked his chart. Doesn't say specifically. Just that someone alerted the store. Before Stephen could ask more, the door burst open. Anthony Musk strode in, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie loosened, his face pale with exhaustion and barely contained emotion. Dad. The word came out broken. Anthony stopped at the foot of the bed, gripping the rail. Dad, I'm still here, son. Stephen managed a weak smile. Anthony moved to the bedside, sinking into the chair as if his legs couldn't hold him anymore. The doctor said if the ambulance had been even 10 minutes later. He stopped, his throat working. Stephen reached out his hand, the one without the 4. Anthony took it immediately, gripping tight. Someone found me, Stephen said slowly. Before the ambulance. A child. Anthony frowned. Dad, you were unconscious when the paramedics arrived. Your brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. No. Stephen's voice was firmer now despite his weakness. Before that, there was a little girl. She tried to help me. I remember her hands. So small and cold. He paused, the memory crystallizing. She gave me something. Food, I think. Then she ran. She ran to get help. Anthony studied his father's face. Stephen Musk was stubborn, proud, sometimes infuriatingly independent. But he wasn't a man who confused reality with hallucination. Okay, Anthony said finally. So there was a girl. We have to find her, Anthony. Stephen's grip tightened. She didn't have anything. I could see that. Her clothes, her shoes, she had nothing. And she still helped me. Anthony was quiet for a moment. He dealt in numbers, contracts, measurable outcomes. But he'd almost lost his father last night. And if his father said some nameless child in an alley had saved his life, then maybe they owed it to both of them to find out who she was. All right, Anthony said quietly. We'll find her. 2 days later, against his doctor's strong objections, Stephen checked himself out of the hospital. The first stop was Lambert's drugstore. Joanna Wilson looked up when they entered, her expression shifting to surprise when she saw Stephen, pale, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane, but alive. I'm Anthony Musk. Anthony stepped forward. This is my father, Stephen. You called 911 for him 2 nights ago. Recognition flickered across Joanna's face. Yeah. How are you feeling? Alive, thanks to whoever made that call, Stephen said. That would be me, Joanna said. But I wasn't the one who found you. Who did? Anthony asked. Joanna hesitated. A kid came in. Couldn't talk, or wouldn't, I don't know. She just kept pointing outside. Then Joanna paused, remembering. She put down $5.37 on my counter. Every cent she had, probably. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Stephen leaned forward on his cane. This girl, do you know her name? Vivian, Joanna said. Vivian Stones. That's what Father Paul used to call her before he died. She doesn't have a home. Sleeps behind the store sometimes. Do you have security cameras? Anthony asked. 5 minutes later, they were crowded around Joanna's small back office, watching grainy, black and white footage. The timestamp read 7:13 p.m. The drugstore door opened, and there she was, a small figure in an oversized hoodie, her hair pulled into a messy bun, shoes that didn't match. She moved frantically, desperately, running up to the counter. Even in the low-quality video, Stephen could see it. The moment she held up her money, both arms stretched high like she was offering up everything she had. Because she was. Stephen reached out and touched the monitor screen, his finger hovering over the frozen image of her face. That's her, he whispered. That's the one who saved me. Anthony stared at the screen. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, and she'd given up what was probably her life savings to save a complete stranger. We need to find her, Stephen said again, his voice rough with emotion. Anthony nodded slowly. Yeah, Dad, we do. They spent 3 days searching. St. Jude's Parish was their first stop, where a new young priest confirmed he knew Vivian sort of, but had no idea where she stayed. The soup kitchen volunteers recognized her immediately, the quiet girl who never spoke, who always waited until everyone else had eaten. The owner of the corner store had seen her collecting cans. The librarian remembered her sitting in the children's section, reading books she never checked out. Everyone knew her by sight. No one knew where to find her. It's like chasing smoke. Anthony said on the third evening, frustration creeping into his voice. Stephen sat heavily on a bench in the small park across from St. Jude's, exhausted. The search was taking its toll on his recovering heart, but he refused to stop. That night, Stephen said quietly, she didn't leave me alone in the dark. He turned to look at his son. How can I leave her out here now? Anthony had no answer for that. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, Anthony made one last decision. Come on. St. Jude's runs a soup kitchen tonight. If she comes by for food, maybe. They arrived as twilight deepened into full darkness. Warm light spilled from the church hall windows. Inside, a line of people waited, weathered faces, tired eyes, a few teenagers, and some elderly couples holding hands. Then Stephen's breath caught. Near the back of the line stood a small figure. Faded bull's hoodie, white bag clutched to her chest, mismatched shoes leaving wet prints on the floor. That's her, Stephen breathed. They watched as Vivian reached the front of the line. A volunteer checked a clipboard, then looked apologetic. I'm sorry, honey. You're not on today's list. We have limited portions, and... She glanced at the nearly empty pot. I'm afraid we're all out. Vivian stood very still. Then she nodded, just once, a tiny movement, and stepped out of line. She turned toward the door, hugging her bag tighter, her small shoulders hunched against the world. Stephen moved before Anthony could stop him. He stepped forward, leaning on his cane, and called out, Wait. Vivian froze. She turned slowly, and when her eyes met Stephen's, recognition flashed across her face like lightning. The man from the alley. Stephen walked toward her carefully until he was a few feet away. Up close, he could see how thin she was, how her hoodie hung off her shoulders, how her hands were red and chapped from the cold. He lowered himself slowly, painfully, down to one knee so they were at eye level. You're Vivian, he said softly. She didn't answer, but her eyes widened slightly. My name is Stephen. He placed one hand over his heart. You saved my life. Vivian's lips pressed together. She looked down at her mismatched shoes. I can't pay you back for what you did, Stephen continued, his voice steady but his eyes wet. That money you gave, I don't have a way to replace it. He paused, letting the weight of his next word settle. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to give you something else. A home, a warm bed, a place where you don't have to wait in line for food anymore." The church hall had gone quiet. People were watching now, the volunteers, the other people in line, everyone bearing witness to this moment. Vivian looked up at Stephen. She'd spent so long being invisible, being overlooked, being nothing. And now this man, this stranger whose life she'd saved, was kneeling in front of her, in front of everyone, offering her the one thing she'd never had: a home. Anthony stepped forward, crouching down beside his father. "Hi, Vivian," he said gently. "I'm Anthony, Stephen's son." He offered a small smile. "If you want, you can call me Uncle Anthony. And if you come with us, we'll take care of you. I promise." Vivian's hands tightened on her bag. She looked at Stephen, then at Anthony, then at the faces watching from around the hall. For the first time in longer than she could remember, people were really seeing her. Slowly, so slowly, Vivian reached out one small hand and touched the edge of Stephen's coat sleeve. Not a handshake, not a hug. Just a touch, a single fingertip against worn fabric. But it was enough. Stephen's face broke into a smile, tears spilling over. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, sweetheart. Let's get you out of the cold." He stood with Anthony's help, and together they walked toward the door. Vivian followed, her mismatched shoes squeaking softly on the floor. At the doorway, one of the volunteers, an older woman who'd known Father Paul, stopped them briefly. She placed a gentle hand on Vivian's shoulder. "You go on, child," she said softly. "You've survived long enough. It's time you had a real home." Vivian looked up at her, and for the first time in a long time, the corners of her mouth lifted into the smallest hint of a smile. Outside, winter rain had started falling. Anthony held an umbrella over Vivian as they walked to his Mercedes. She climbed into the back seat, clutching her bag in her lap, and as they pulled away from St. Jude's, she pressed her face to the window. The church disappeared behind them, and Vivian watched the streets she'd known, the alleys where she'd slept, the corners where she'd begged, the doorways where she'd hidden, fade into the rainy darkness. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time since her mother had abandoned her, she wasn't alone. The Musk estate sat in Oak Park, a world away from the South Side alleys. When Anthony's car pulled through the iron gates and up the curved driveway, Vivian pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass. The house was massive, 3 stories of pale stone with tall windows that glowed with warm light. Manicured lawns stretched in every direction, and in the distance, she could see trees surrounding what looked like a small lake. "This is where you live." The words slipped out before she could stop them, the first time she'd spoken in front of them. Stephen and Anthony exchanged surprised glances. Stephen smiled. "This is where we live now," he corrected gently. Inside, the house smelled like wood polish and something baking. A housekeeper named Mrs. Chun greeted them with a warm smile and knowing eyes that lingered on Vivian's thin frame and worn clothes. "I prepared the blue room upstairs," Mrs. Chun said, "and there's soup warming in the kitchen whenever you're ready." Anthony led Vivian up a wide staircase, past walls hung with oil paintings and family photographs. He stopped at a door near the end of the second floor hallway and opened it. "This is yours," he said simply. Vivian stood frozen in the doorway. The room wasn't large, maybe 12 by 12, but to her it was vast. A real bed with a thick comforter, a desk by the window, a bookshelf waiting to be filled, curtains that matched the bedspread, and on the pillow sat a brown teddy bear with black button eyes and a small red bow around its neck. She took one tentative step inside, then another. Her hand reached out to touch the comforter, soft, clean, dry. After years of sleeping on concrete and cardboard, the texture was almost alien. "It's not much," Anthony said from the doorway, "but it's yours. No one else's. You can close the door whenever you want." Vivian turned to look at him, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and fragile hope. Bathrooms across the hall, Anthony continued. Towels are in the cabinet. Tomorrow we'll go shopping for clothes and anything else you need. He smiled. Take your time settling in. Come down whenever you're ready. After he left, Vivian stood in the center of the room for a long time, just looking. At the bed that was all hers. At the window with its view of gardens and trees. At the bear waiting on the pillow. She set her white bag carefully on the desk and opened it. One by one, she pulled out her treasures and arranged them on the desk surface. A broken toy car, a one-armed doll, a chipped yellow spoon. Her whole world fit on one small desk. She picked up the teddy bear. It was heavier than she expected, stuffed firm, the fur soft against her cheek. She held it close and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave slightly under her weight, so different from cold pavement. Vivian lay back slowly, still clutching the bear, and stared up at the ceiling. From downstairs came the low murmur of voices, Stephen and Anthony talking, normal household sounds, sounds that meant people nearby who wanted her there. That night, after a warm bath and a bowl of Mrs. Chen's soup, Vivian put on the clean pajamas that had been left on her bed. They were too big, but they were soft and smelled like lavender. She climbed under the covers, the teddy bear tucked against her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt warm all the way through. The weeks that followed brought changes Vivian couldn't have imagined. Mornings meant breakfast at an actual table, eggs and toast and orange juice. Stephen would sit with her, reading his newspaper and telling stories about his childhood. Slowly, tentatively, Vivian began to respond. Not with many words at first, just small sounds of acknowledgement, a whispered yes or thank you. Anthony came home from work every evening and always asked, "How was your day, Vivian?" At first, she just nodded. But one night she whispered, "Good." Anthony's face lit up like she'd given him a precious gift. "Yeah," he said, grinning. "I'm glad." 3 weeks after her arrival, Stephen decided to clean up the kitchen himself one morning. Mrs. Chun had the day off, and Anthony had already left for work. Stephen hummed as he washed dishes, reaching up to put a mug back on the high shelf. His knee, still weak from the heart attack and recovery, suddenly buckled. The mug slipped from his fingers and shattered on the tile floor. Stephen grabbed for the counter, but his knee gave out completely. He went down hard, pain shooting up his leg. Upstairs, Vivian heard the crash. She dropped her book and ran. By the time she reached the kitchen, Stephen was on the floor, gripping his knee, his face pale and twisted with pain. "Stephen." The name burst out of her before she could stop it. She dropped to her knees beside him, her small hands fluttering over his arm, not sure where to touch. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Stephen looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise. Not because he was in pain, but because Vivian had spoken. Really spoken. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he managed, his voice rough. "Just my old knee acting up. You're bleeding." Vivian pointed at his palm, where he'd cut it on a shard of the broken mug. Just a scratch. But Vivian was already running to the bathroom. She came back with the entire first aid kit, setting it on the floor beside him with trembling hands. She pulled out a bandage and carefully pressed it over the cut, smoothing it down with gentle fingers. "There," she whispered. Stephen smiled, a real, full smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Thank you, Vivian." She looked up at him, her eyes suddenly brimming with tears. "You scared me. I don't want you to get hurt again." Stephen reached out and pulled her into a hug, gentle, careful, giving her space to pull away if she wanted. But Vivian didn't pull away. She leaned into him, pressing her face against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, she let herself cry. Stephen held her, one hand rubbing slow circles on her back, and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. When Anthony came home that evening and heard what had happened, he stood outside Vivian's door for a long moment, his hand pressed against the wood. Then louder through the door, "Hey, Vivian, you doing okay in there?" A pause. Then muffled but clear, "Yeah, I'm okay." Anthony's smile widened. "Good." Dinner's in 20 minutes. Okay. He walked downstairs feeling lighter than he had in years, knowing that behind that door, a little girl who had been silent for so long was finally beginning to find her voice. And in her room, Vivian sat on her bed, holding her teddy bear, looking around at the space that was truly hers. For the first time in her life, she had a home. For the first time, she had a family. For the first time, she mattered. If you enjoyed this story, we'd appreciate it if you support us with a like and subscribe to our channel, Twister Stories. Thanks for your unconditional support in every story. Blessings to you and your family.